I'm 58 now, and my life is quiet in the way people assume is peaceful. Same little coastal town for 12 years, same morning routine. Kettle whining, the neighbor's sprinklers ticking, my dog's nails clicking across the kitchen tile like impatient punctuation. I teach part-time at the community college. I grow tomatoes that split if you look at them wrong, and I've gotten very good at smiling through questions I don't want to answer. Most people here think I'm independent. That's the polite word for a woman who lives alone and doesn't explain herself. What they don't know is I once ran away from my own wedding. Not metaphorically. Not, I called it off. I mean, I was in white, hair pinned into something stiff and expensive, mascara already threatening, and I bolted. I left a church full of guests blinking in confusion, a string quartet stumbling into silence, and a man at the altar who looked so sure of me that it still makes my stomach flip. I built an entire adult life on top of that moment, like pouring concrete over a sinkhole and pretending the ground is stable. Then, last month, the house next door finally sold. I watched the moving truck back into the driveway, listened to the thud of furniture through the afternoon air, and told myself it was none of my business, until I saw him step out and lift his face into the sun like he'd been holding his breath for 35 years. When I try to explain what happened back then, people expect some dramatic villain, a cheating scandal, a secret baby, someone getting cold feet because they weren't ready. The truth is uglier because it's ordinary. It was fear mixed with pride, and a lie that grew legs. I was 23. I just finished my teaching credential, still living like everything was temporary. Apartment walls that sweated in summer, hand-me-down furniture, a future that felt like a blouse I hadn't tried on yet. Daniel was the opposite. Organized, steady, the kind of man who made plans with actual dates on them and meant it. His mother adored him like he was a saint she'd personally raised, and I spent most Sundays feeling examined under her bright, polite smile. 2 weeks before the wedding, my best friend, Marissa, pulled me into my tiny kitchen, hands shaking so hard she sloshed wine onto the counter. She said, "I need you to promise you won't confront him." That sentence alone was a match. Then she told me she'd seen Daniel leaving a motel off Highway 9. Not alone. She said she recognized the woman. Someone from his office. The pretty one. The one who always touched his arm at parties. Marissa didn't have proof, just certainty. And I believed her because she looked like she was bleeding from the mouth. I didn't ask Daniel. I didn't even breathe right. I just started replaying every moment I'd ever felt small next to him and decided this was the explanation. And once you have an explanation, you start building a whole story around it. The morning after I ran, my phone became a weapon. Missed calls stacked like bruises. My mother left voicemails that started controlled and ended unhinged. Daniel didn't leave any. That silence felt worse, like a door quietly locked from the inside. I drove until the gas light came on and parked outside a diner 2 towns over, still wearing the dress. A waitress asked if I was okay and I laughed too hard, mascara finally surrendering down my cheeks. By noon, the story had already outpaced me. People filled in the blanks with whatever made sense to them. I was unstable. I was dramatic. I was selfish. Someone said I'd had an affair. Someone else said Daniel hit me. The truth, fear, and an untested accusation was too boring to circulate. My parents stopped speaking to me for nearly a year. Invitations dried up. Friends picked sides without asking what side I was on. Marissa apologized once, tearfully, then moved across the country and out of my life like she'd been erased with a wet cloth. Daniel's name became a landmine. If someone said it, even casually, my chest locked up like a car door. I quit my job and took a temporary position 2 hours away, telling myself it was for experience. I learned how to be new over and over again. New apartment, new coworkers, new version of myself who didn't flinch when someone mentioned weddings. But every time I saw a white dress in a shop window, I felt that same drop in my stomach, like missing a step in the dark, and I wondered if the ground had ever been solid at all. The years didn't heal anything the way people promise. They just layered over it. I moved cities, then states, then finally circled back to the coast like a homing pigeon that forgot what home meant. I dated men who were safe because they didn't ask much of me. I married one briefly, kind, distant, mutually convenient, and divorced him with the same calm paperwork energy you use to cancel a gym membership. No kids. That part was intentional. I couldn't trust myself not to disappear again. Daniel became a sealed box in my head. I told myself thinking about him was pointless, but certain things cracked the seal anyway. The smell of old books, men who stood too straight, a particular laugh that started low and surprised itself halfway through. I'd imagine him married, successful, relieved to be rid of me. I hoped he hated me. Hate felt cleaner than whatever else he might feel. Every anniversary of the wedding date, my body remembered before my mind did. Tight chest, shallow breath. I'd invent errands just to stay busy. Like grief could be outpaced. I never reached out. Pride masqueraded as respect. Fear wore the costume of maturity. Sometimes, late at night, I replayed the unanswered question I'd buried. What if Marissa was wrong? I'd shove it away because regret is easier when it stays theoretical. You can live with what if. You can't live easily with I ruined everything for nothing. So decades passed. Whole lives fit inside them. Wrinkles arrived quietly. Hair grayed at the temples. I learned how to be alone so well that it felt like a skill set. I truly believed that chapter was sealed forever, until the moving truck appeared next door, and time folded in on itself without asking my permission. I noticed the for sale sign come down on a Tuesday, the kind of weekday that doesn't expect surprises. By Friday, a moving truck squatted next door like it planned to stay. I watched from my kitchen window under the pretense of rinsing dishes, cataloging strangers' furniture out of habit more than curiosity. Couch wrapped in plastic. A scratched oak table. Boxes labeled books in thick black marker. Then I saw the hands. That sounds ridiculous, but grief teaches you to recognize people by fragments. Those hands had always been careful, steady even when lifting heavy things, fingers spread like they trusted the weight. My chest tightened before my brain caught up. I told myself it was projection, the emotional equivalent of seeing shapes in clouds. When he stepped fully into view, time didn't slow. It snapped. Daniel looked older, of course he did, but unmistakably himself. Thinner hair, lines around his eyes, the same posture like he was bracing against wind that wasn't there. He laughed at something the driver said, and the sound reached me through the open window, low and familiar enough to make my knees soften. I dropped the plate I was holding. It shattered, sharp and final, the sound echoing in my quiet kitchen. I crouched on the floor with ceramic biting into my palm and felt 23 all over again. Panicked, unprepared, suddenly aware that running only works if the past doesn't know your address. By evening, his porch light came on next door, a warm square of yellow against the dark. I sat on my couch, lights off, heart hammering, realizing the universe had finally stopped letting me avoid the question I dodged for 35 years. Daniel hadn't just reappeared. He'd moved in. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt amplified, like my house had decided to betray me. The refrigerator clicked on and I flinched. A car passed and I was sure it was him, somehow already walking up my driveway with answers I wasn't ready to hear. I kept replaying the way he'd lifted his face into the sun, like a man arriving somewhere he hadn't planned on. By morning, my hands were shaking badly enough that I spilled coffee down the sink. I stood there gripping the counter, whispering okay to no one, as if calm could be summoned on command. Shock is a strange thing. It's not loud. It's quiet and clinical, like your body deciding to shut down unnecessary systems to conserve power. I went through the motions of my day: shower, clothes, leash on the dog, but everything felt like a performance I hadn't rehearsed. I kept imagining scenarios. He recognizes me immediately. He doesn't recognize me at all. He's furious. He's polite. He's moved on so thoroughly that I'm just another neighbor with a dog and a history he's already buried. Each version hurt differently. The worst was the possibility that he'd forgiven me without ever understanding why I ran. Around noon, I heard footsteps on the gravel between our houses. I froze, heart slamming against my ribs, lungs refusing to cooperate. I realized then how much I'd built my life around avoidance. I'd mistaken distance for safety, silence for healing. Now the past was 10 feet away, separated by a fence and decades of unsaid words. And the truth landed hard. I wasn't ready for him, but time clearly didn't care. The first conversation wasn't dramatic. That almost made it worse. It happened 3 days later, on a gray afternoon that smelled like salt and wet pavement. I was dragging my trash bin back up the driveway, rehearsing imaginary speeches I'd never deliver, when I heard my name said out loud. Not loudly, carefully. Claire? I turned so fast I nearly tipped the bin. He stood by the low fence between our yards, hands shoved into his jacket pockets like he didn't trust them. Up close, the years showed more clearly. Creased skin, silver threaded through his hair. But his eyes were the same, earnest in a way that felt dangerous. "Hi," I said, because apparently I'd lost every word except the smallest one. He nodded, like we were strangers who'd met before but couldn't place it. "I thought it was you. I didn't want to assume." A pause. "You look well." I almost laughed. I almost cried. Instead I said, "You too," which felt like a lie and a truth at the same time. We stood there, fence between us, the ocean wind tugging at his jacket. He asked about my dog. I asked about the move, safe topics, civilian conversation. But underneath it all was a hum, like exposed wiring. He watched me like he was waiting for something, an apology maybe, or a confession. Before heading back, he said, "I've thought about you more than I should admit." Then quickly, "Not in a bad way." That sentence followed me inside and rattled around my chest, because it suggested something unfinished, something he still didn't know. The reveal didn't come like a confession. It came sideways, the way truth often does when it's been waiting decades. A week after that first talk, Daniel knocked on my door holding a misdelivered envelope. My name was on it, his address underneath, like the universe nudging us closer with administrative irony. He stepped inside, glanced around my living room, and said softly, "You kept the blue lamp." I hadn't realized it was still ours until then. We sat. The air felt thick. After a minute he said, "I should tell you something. I almost didn't move here because of you." My throat tightened. He went on, staring at his hands. "After you ran, I spent years thinking I'd missed something obvious, that I'd betrayed you somehow." I finally said it, the sentence I'd swallowed for 35 years. "Marissa told me you were cheating." He blinked. Once. Then his face collapsed inward, like something finally clicked. "The motel?" he asked. I nodded. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Claire, I was there with your father." The room tilted. "He asked me to help him plan a surprise renewal vow for your parents. He didn't want your mom to know. We met there because he was embarrassed." My ears rang. He added quietly, "Marissa was sleeping with someone from my office. She begged me not to tell you." I thought she had. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded with all the years I'd built on a lie that wasn't even his. That truth didn't explode my life. It seeped into it, slow and corrosive. After Daniel left that night, I sat on the floor staring at the blue lamp, my hands numb, my chest aching in a way that felt ancient. Everything I'd accepted as fixed history suddenly felt editable, and that was terrifying. I started seeing my past like a poorly developed photograph. Moments sharpened in hindsight. Marissa's shaking hands, yes, but also her insistence I not confront him. My father's sudden discomfort around the wedding planning. Daniel's silence after I ran. Not indifference, but shock layered with loyalty. I'd mistaken dignity for guilt. It changed how I saw myself, too. I'd always framed my younger self as brave for leaving, as someone who refused to settle for betrayal. Now I saw a girl who panicked and chose disappearance over conversation. That realization landed heavy. It asked for accountability I'd avoided my entire adult life. My presence started to feel unstable. The stories I told students about resilience rang hollow. Even my solitude felt suspect. Had I chosen it, or had I built it to avoid the risk of being wrong again? I watched Daniel from my window sometimes, the way he moved through his days, and felt grief for a life that had almost been. The worst part wasn't losing him back then. It was realizing how many choices since had been shaped by a single untested assumption. Regret isn't loud. It's persistent, like a drip you can't unhear once you notice it. And now that I'd noticed, there was no going back to the quiet I'd curated so carefully. The emotional conflict hit a few days later, when avoidance stopped working. Daniel caught me outside while I was pruning a rosebush I barely remembered planting. He watched for a moment, then said, "We should probably talk. Really talk." There was no accusation in his voice, which somehow made everything sharper. I dropped the shears. My hands were shaking too badly to hide it. "I don't know how," I admitted. "Every version of this conversation ends with me being the villain." He flinched at that. "I never needed a villain," he said. "I just needed the truth." Something in me snapped then. All that stored composure, decades of carefully folded regret, came undone. I told him how trapped I'd felt back then, how small, how terrified of being foolish. I told him I'd believed the lie because it gave my fear a respectable shape. My voice broke when I said, "Running felt like the only way to survive." He didn't interrupt. He just listened, eyes glossy, jaw tight. When I finished, the silence was unbearable. I wanted him to yell, to punish me, to balance the scales. Instead, he said quietly, "You disappeared, Claire. I spent years thinking I wasn't worth an explanation." That landed harder than anger ever could. I felt the full weight of what I'd done, not just to him, but to the version of myself that might have learned how to stay. I sank onto the porch step and cried like someone much younger, realizing too late that self-protection can look a lot like cruelty from the other side. Daniel finally told his side on a Sunday evening, the kind that stretches out and invites honesty. We sat on his porch, the air cooling, the sound of waves dull and rhythmic in the distance. He spoke slowly, like he'd rehearsed this alone for years and was afraid of getting it wrong now that there was an audience. After I ran, he said he didn't chase me because he thought that's what I wanted. My mother had told him to give me space. My father wouldn't meet his eyes. Friends stopped calling. He canceled the honeymoon and went alone to the coast for 3 days, sitting on the beach in the same jacket, watching couples walk past like ghosts from a future he'd misplaced. He told me he never dated Marissa, never trusted her again, but also never outed her lie because he believed she'd already confessed. "I thought you knew," he said. "I thought you chose to leave anyway." He married once later, to a woman who needed him but never quite saw him. It lasted 10 years and ended quietly. No bitterness, just erosion. "I didn't move here to reopen anything," he added. "I moved here because it felt unfinished, like there was a sentence without a period." Hearing his story didn't absolve me, but it complicated everything. Pain layered over pain, misunderstandings stacked like dominoes. There was no clean villain, no simple redemption. Just two people making decisions with partial information and living with the consequences far longer than either of us deserved. For the first time, I understood that closure isn't an ending. It's an understanding. The climax came unexpectedly, not as a dramatic declaration, but as a breaking point I couldn't hold past anymore. A storm rolled in that night, loud and impatient, rain hitting the roofs like thrown gravel. I found myself knocking on Daniel's door, soaked through, heart racing like I'd sprinted the whole way even though it was 10 steps. He opened it, startled, and I didn't give us time to retreat into politeness. "I'm so sorry," I said, the words tumbling out raw and unshaped. "Not for leaving, though that too, but for never giving you the dignity of the truth. For letting you believe you weren't enough to stay for." I started crying before I finished. Ugly, gasping sobs that bent me forward. He pulled me inside without a word, shut the door on the storm, and just stood there while I unraveled. 35 years collapsed into that hallway. All the restraint I'd mistaken for strength gave way. When I finally looked up, he was crying too, quietly. "I would have stayed," he said. "I would have talked. I would have fought for us if you'd let me." "I know," I whispered, and that was the most painful part, knowing it now when knowing couldn't rewind anything. We didn't fix the past. There was no kiss, no sweeping reunion. Just two older people standing in the wreckage of a shared history, finally telling the truth out loud. And somehow, in that honesty, something loosened, not erased, but acknowledged. It felt like setting down a weight I'd forgotten I was carrying. The resolution wasn't dramatic, which felt right after everything else. There was no declaration about lost time or promises to make up for it. What I decided quietly was to stop running, even from outcomes I couldn't control. Daniel and I talked the next morning over burnt toast and too strong coffee. The rain rinsed clean from the world outside. We agreed not to pretend we were 23 again. Nostalgia can be another kind of lie. I apologized again, this time without collapsing. He accepted it without conditions. That mattered more than forgiveness framed as mercy. We decided to be honest neighbors first, to learn who we were now, without letting the ghosts run the conversation. No expectations, no rewriting history, just curiosity and respect. For me, the bigger decision was internal. I stopped shielding myself with old narratives. I told my parents the full story, including my part in it. I emailed Marissa after decades of silence. Not to accuse, just to say I knew. I didn't need her response to move on. Naming the truth was enough. I also chose to forgive my younger self, not by excusing her, but by understanding her limits. She did the best she could with fear and bad information. I don't have to keep punishing her forever. Some chapters don't reopen. They integrate. I let this one settle into my life without trying to force an ending it never promised to give. The outcome showed up in small, almost unnoticeable ways. I slept better. My shoulders dropped an inch. I stopped bracing for questions that never came. Daniel and I fell into an easy rhythm. Shared fence repairs, borrowed tools, occasional dinners that stayed light by mutual, unspoken agreement. There was affection, yes, but also a respect for the years that had shaped us separately. People noticed a change in me before I did. A colleague said I seemed lighter. My students lingered after class, drawn to something steadier in my voice. I started accepting invitations instead of inventing reasons to leave early. I even planted a new rosebush, deliberately this time, knowing it would need care and patience. Daniel eventually told me he was dating someone in the next town over. The old me would have flinched, made it mean something about my worth or timing. Instead, I felt something like peace. Our connection wasn't diminished by paths that didn't converge. It was clarified. We talked sometimes about the wedding day, not with bitterness but curiosity. Two people trying to understand how easily love can be redirected by fear. I realized then that my life hadn't been empty. It had been cautious. There's a difference. Nothing about my days changed dramatically, but the quiet I lived in shifted. It no longer felt like hiding, felt chosen, and that made all the difference. I think about that moment sometimes. The way he stepped out of the moving truck and into my life again, uninvited and unavoidable. Time has a strange sense of humor like that. It doesn't rush. It waits until you're certain a door is closed, then knocks from the other side. What I learned isn't that love conquers all. That's a neat story people tell to make endings feel earned. What I learned is quieter and harder. Silence is never neutral. Avoidance doesn't preserve you. It just delays the reckoning. And fear, when left unchallenged, will happily run your life while convincing you it's protecting you. I don't romanticize what Daniel and I lost. We lost something real, and no amount of insight can resurrect it. But I don't live inside that loss anymore. Understanding transformed it from an open wound into a scar. Still visible, still tender in certain weather, but no longer defining every movement. If there's wisdom in this, it's this: ask the question. Have the conversation. Risk being wrong out loud instead of right in isolation. Time doesn't grant do-overs, but occasionally, if you're unlucky and brave enough, it offers clarity. And sometimes that has to be enough.